A single crack of sound, sharp and ugly, echoed in the humid afternoon air. It wasn't a gunshot. It was the sound of a hand striking a face. Officer Victoria Peterson, a woman who ruled her beat like a personal kingdom, had just slapped a man for the simple crime of questioning her authority. But this wasn't just any man. He was calm, he was dignified, and he was Judge Jackson. In that deafening silence that followed the slap, as the judge slowly raised a hand to his cheek. Officer Peterson's world, her carefully constructed empire built on fear and intimidation, began to fracture. She just didn't know it yet. Officer Victoria Peterson. Vicky to her friends. Queen Vicky, to the unfortunate souls who crossed her on a bad day, cruised the leafy, sun-dappled streets of the city's affluent North Ward in her patrol car. Her kingdom. For 10 years, she had cultivated a reputation that was equal parts respect and fear. She was the daughter of a retired, highly decorated, and notoriously aggressive police captain, and she wore her legacy like a second badge. She was untouchable, a bastion of law and order, who believed the line between the two was hers to draw. Her partner for the day was a rookie Officer Miller, a fresh-faced kid, barely out of the academy, who still believed in community policing and de-escalation. He sat in the passenger seat, a silent observer to Vicky's running commentary on the filth that was slowly seeping into her ward. "Look at this," Vicky sneered, gesturing with her chin toward a gleaming dark blue Lincoln Aviator that had just signaled a turn ahead of them. Too much car for this neighborhood. Bet you $100 the plates are dirty or the driver's got a warrant. Miller glanced at the car. "It's a nice car, Vicky. Maybe he just lives here." "People like that don't just live here, kid," she retorted, her voice dripping with condescension. "They come here to cause trouble." With a flick of her wrist, she hit the lights. The siren chirped once, a sharp command to pull over. The Lincoln complied immediately, pulling smoothly to the curb. There was no hesitation, no sudden moves. Just a calm, professional stop. Vicky was out of her car before Miller had his door open. Her stride was a predator's stalk, her hand already resting on the butt of her holstered Glock. She bypassed the driver's door instead, rapping her knuckles sharply on the rear passenger window. "Can't follow simple instructions," she barked when the driver's window rolled down. A man in his late 50s, with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard and intelligent, weary eyes, looked at her. He was wearing a simple but well-tailored polo shirt and slacks. "Good afternoon, officer. Was I speeding?" His voice was calm, a deep baritone that held no trace of fear or aggression. "I'll ask the questions," Vicky snapped. "License and registration." The man nodded slowly, reaching for the glove compartment. "Of course. May I ask why I was pulled over failure to signal 100 feet before a turn?" She said, the lie tasting like honey on her tongue. It was the oldest trick in the book, a phantom infraction that was impossible to disprove. "I'm quite certain I signaled." The man replied, his voice still even. He handed over his license and the vehicle's registration. Vicky snatched them from his hand. The name on the license read Jackson, Judge Theron Jackson. The address was a sprawling estate in the very heart of the North Ward, a place of old money and influence. A flicker of something doubt confusion crossed Vicky's face, but her arrogance snuffed it out. It had to be fake, a high-quality forgery. "Judge, huh?" Vicky chuckled a harsh, grating sound. She tossed the documents back into the car. "Nice try, pal. I've seen better fakes from teenagers trying to buy beer. Step out of the vehicle." Officer Judge Jackson said, his patience beginning to fray at the edges. "I can assure you that is my legal identification. I am a sitting judge in the Superior Court. I am on my way to a charity luncheon at the country club, just a few blocks from here." "Oh, the country club," Vicky mocked, drawing out the words. She leaned closer, her face inches from his. "I'm tired of you people lying to me. Get out of the car now!" Her voice rose to a shout. Miller had circled around to the passenger side, his face a mask of growing unease. "Vicky, maybe we should just run the name." "Stay out of this, Miller," she snarled, never taking her eyes off the judge. Judge Jackson let out a long, slow sigh. He knew this type of officer. He'd seen them in his courtroom, their testimonies full of bravado and inconsistencies. Arguing was pointless. He put the car in park and unbuckled his seatbelt. "Very well, officer. But I want you to know that this is being recorded by my vehicle's internal dashcam system, and I will be filing a formal complaint." The word complaint was a trigger. For Vicky, it was a challenge to her authority, an affront to her throne. It was the final straw. As Judge Jackson stood up, turning to face her, his hands raised in a clear, non-threatening gesture, Vicky's training, her professionalism, her duty to the law, it all vanished, replaced by pure, unadulterated rage. "You're not in a position to file anything," she spat. And then she slapped him. The sound was shockingly loud. It was a sharp, vicious crack that seemed to silence the world. The force of it snapped the judge's head to the side. A red mark instantly began to bloom on his dark skin. Miller froze, his mouth agape. A woman walking her dog across the street gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Time seemed to stutter. For a full 5 seconds, no one moved. Judge Jackson slowly brought his hand up to his face, his fingers gently touching his stinging cheek. He turned his head back, and his eyes, which had been weary and patient, were now like chips of obsidian. They weren't angry. They weren't vengeful. They were something far more terrifying. They were focused. He looked past the snarling face of Officer Peterson and met the horrified gaze of Officer Miller. "Young man," the judge said, his voice quiet, but carrying the immense weight of the law, "I suggest you call your watch commander. And then I suggest you call the chief of police. Inform them that Officer Victoria Peterson has just assaulted a Superior Court judge. And tell them the empire is about to fall." The 5 seconds of stunned silence after the slap felt like an eternity. For Vicky, it was a moment of pure adrenaline-fueled triumph. She had put another arrogant criminal in his place. Her chest puffed out, the sneer still plastered on her face. But the silence was shattered, not by her, but by the calm, authoritative voice of the man she had just struck. His words, directed at her partner, cut through the thick, humid air like a surgeon's scalpel. Miller, who had been paralyzed with a mixture of fear and disbelief, flinched as if the judge had shouted. He looked from the judge's cold, unwavering eyes to Vicky's smug grin, and in that instant the rookie saw his career flashing before his eyes. He fumbled for his shoulder radio, his hands shaking. "Vicky, what did you do?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "I did my job," she hissed. Her eyes still locked on the judge. He was refusing a lawful order. He wasn't. He was complying. Miller's voice rose, tinged with panic. "Dispatch, this is 7. Adam." Miller stammered into his radio. I need a watch commander at my location, North Elm Street and Patterson Avenue. Send a senior officer, immediately." "What the hell are you doing?" "Miller, Vicky rounded on him, her face contorting with rage. "Are you undermining me?" "You assaulted him," Miller shot back, finally finding a sliver of backbone. Judge Jackson simply stood there, a silent, powerful monument to Vicky's catastrophic miscalculation. He hadn't moved, hadn't threatened, hadn't even raised his voice. He watched the two officers argue, his expression unreadable. He could already see the dominoes beginning to wobble. Within minutes, a second patrol car screamed to a halt behind theirs. Sergeant Frank O'Malley, a veteran with 25 years on the force and a face like a worn leather satchel, stepped out. He was the evening watch commander, a man who had seen it all and whose primary goal was to get through his shift with as little paperwork as possible. This did not look like a little paperwork. He took in the scene, Vicky red-faced and defensive, Miller pale and terrified, and a well-dressed black man with a bright red handprint on his cheek, standing beside a high-end SUV with the quiet dignity of a man who owned the very ground he stood on. "What in God's name is going on here, Peterson?" O'Malley barked, striding toward them. "Sarge, this perp was—" Vicky began launching into her pre-packaged story. He was belligerent, refused to identify himself, claimed to be a judge. "I had to use minimal force to— His name is Judge Theron Jackson." O'Malley interrupted, his eyes wide with horror. He had recognized him instantly. Everyone who worked in law enforcement in this city knew Judge Jackson. He was a pillar of the legal community, famous for being tough but scrupulously fair. He'd sent cops to jail and exonerated others. He was the last man on earth you wanted to cross. O'Malley's weathered face seemed to age another 10 years. He looked at Vicky as if seeing her for the first time. The arrogance, the legacy of her father, the Queen Vicky persona. He saw it all for what it was, a liability. A ticking time bomb that had just detonated. "Oh, Vicky." He breathed the words coming out as a pained groan. He turned to the judge, his demeanor changing instantly from a commanding officer to an apologetic subordinate. "Judge Jackson, I am so sorry." "Are you all right, sir?" O'Malley asked, his voice thick with deference. "I will be frank." The judge replied, his tone formal. "However, your officer here has committed a crime, assault and battery, and I wish to press charges." Vicky's jaw dropped. "Charges? You can't be serious. He's playing you, Sarge. He's a con man. Shut your mouth, Peterson. Right now." O'Malley roared, a level of fury in his voice she had never heard directed at her. He turned back to the judge. "Sir, of course, we will take your statement. We'll handle this by the book." "There is no we in this, Frank," Judge Jackson corrected him gently. "Your officer has demonstrated a clear and profound lack of judgment. This is now a matter for internal affairs and the district attorney's office. I expect a full and transparent investigation. I also expect Officer Peterson and her body camera to be sequestered immediately." He looked at Miller. "Officer Miller, you were a witness to this. I trust your report will be accurate." Miller swallowed hard and nodded, unable to speak. Vicky felt a cold dread wash over her, finally extinguishing the fire of her rage. The untouchable shield she had worn for a decade had just been shattered. The name Jackson and the title Judge were no longer a con. They were a death sentence for her career. She wasn't Queen Vicky anymore. She was just a cop who had assaulted a judge on a sunny afternoon in the middle of the street with witnesses, as Sergeant O'Malley formally relieved her of her sidearm and told her to wait in the back of his car. The full weight of her actions began to crash down. This wasn't just a complaint. This wasn't a slap on the wrist from a friendly supervisor. This was different. From the back of the patrol car, she watched as Judge Jackson spoke quietly with O'Malley. Not with the anger of a victim, but with the dispassionate authority of a man setting in motion a machine he knew all too well. A machine that once started would not stop until it had run its course. Her empire wasn't just crumbling. It was being systematically dismantled stone by stone. The precinct buzzed with a nervous energy that night. News of the North Ward incident had spread like wildfire, first through hushed whispers and then through official channels. Captain Miles Donovan, a man who owed his position in no small part to Vicky's father, paced his office like a caged animal. He had spent years cultivating a public image of a modern, accountable police force. A single slap had just threatened to burn it all to the ground. "Get me Peterson's file," he barked at his aide. "And I mean everything. Every commendation, every complaint, every whisper." Vicky sat in a sterile interrogation room in the Internal Affairs Division, a place she had only ever seen from the other side of the table. The confidence she'd felt on the street was gone, replaced by a sullen defensive silence. Her union-appointed lawyer, a slick, overworked man named Art Friedman, sat beside her advising her to say nothing. "Officer Peterson, we have your initial statement, and we have Officer Miller's," said Lieutenant Eva Rostova, the lead IA investigator. Rostova was a formidable woman, known for her meticulousness and her immunity to department politics. "They don't match. At all." Vicky just glared at the table. Miller, the spineless rookie, had folded. Of course he had. "Your partner states that Judge Jackson was compliant at all times." Rostova continued her pen tapping a steady rhythm on her notepad. "He states that you were verbally abusive, and that the slap was, in his words, completely unprovoked and unnecessary." "He's a liar," Vicky muttered, ignoring Friedman's sharp glance. "He's a rookie, trying to save his own skin." Izzy Rostova slid a photograph across the table. It was a still from a cell phone video, grainy, but unmistakable. It showed Vicky's hand raised her face, a mask of fury, just an instant before it connected with the judge's cheek. Because a civilian witness, a Mrs. Gable, who was walking her dog, corroborates Officer Miller's account. And she filmed it. Vicky's blood ran cold. The real trouble started the next morning. A local news blogger known for his anti-police stance got the tip. The headline was "Explosive, Queen Vicky's Reign of Terror." Video shows CPD officer striking black judge. The article included Mrs. Gable's shaky cell phone footage. By 9 a.m., it was the lead story on every local news channel. By noon, it was trending nationally. The video was damning. It didn't have audio, but it didn't need it. The visuals told the whole story. Vicky's aggressive posture, the judge's calm demeanor, the shocking violence of the slap. The narrative was set in stone. A racist, power-tripping cop had assaulted a respected member of the community. The chief of police, a politician in a uniform named Warren Moss, was forced to hold a press conference. He stood at a podium flanked by grim-faced city officials and announced that Officer Victoria Peterson had been suspended without pay, pending a full investigation by both Internal Affairs and the District Attorney's Office. The actions seen on that video are deeply disturbing and are not representative of the values of this department, Chief Moss declared, his voice strained. "We will be transparent, and we will hold our officers accountable." For Vicky, watching the press conference from her lawyer's office, it was a profound betrayal. Moss had been at her father's retirement party. He had called her a credit to the force. Now he was throwing her to the wolves. But the true crack in her empire, the one that shook its very foundations, came from within. The blue wall of silence, the unspoken code that officers protect their own, began to crumble under the weight of Vicky's transgression. She hadn't just roughed up a suspect in an alley. She had assaulted a judge in broad daylight and on camera. It was too public, too egregious, and the victim was too powerful. That afternoon, Officer Miller walked into Lieutenant Rostova's office with his lawyer and gave a full, detailed and sworn statement. He recounted not just the slap, but the entire encounter, Vicky's racist commentary in the car, the fabricated reason for the stop, her escalating aggression. He felt sick about it, but he knew Vicky had left him no choice. It was his career or hers, and he was choosing his. The pressure was immense. Civil rights groups were calling for the U.S. Department of Justice to investigate the entire department. The mayor was demanding answers, and Judge Theron Jackson remained a figure of quiet, immense power. He gave a single dignified statement to the press. "I have faith in the justice system I have served for 30 years, he said. "I will allow the process to unfold, and I am confident that justice will be done." His words carried more weight than all the shouting and protesting combined. Back in Captain Donovan's office, the file on Vicky Peterson lay open on his desk. It was thick, thicker than he remembered. There were a dozen complaints over the years, mostly from minority residents, all of them dismissed as unfounded. Allegations of illegal searches, verbal abuse, excessive force. Each one had been smoothed over, explained away, buried by him or her father's allies. He picked up the phone and made a call to an old friend in the district attorney's office. "Listen," Donovan said, his voice low. "About this Peterson case, she's on her own. You hear me? The department is not protecting her on this. We're cutting her loose." The tremor had become an earthquake, and the empire of Queen Vicky, built on a foundation of privilege and fear, was beginning to sink into the ground. The suspension felt like a physical blow. One day, Vicky was a 10-year veteran with a kingdom to patrol. The next, she was a civilian stripped of her badge, her gun, and her identity. Her world once as sprawling and interconnected as the city itself shrank to the four walls of her meticulously clean, sterile apartment. The silence was the worst part. The constant hum of the police radio, the banter with fellow officers, the feeling of being part of something larger than herself. It was all gone. Her attempts to rally her allies were met with a chilling coldness. Calls to officers she'd considered friends went to voicemail. Text messages were left unread. The blue wall she had always trusted as an impenetrable fortress was now a prison, and she was on the outside. They were distancing themselves, saving their own skins. The message was clear. "You're toxic." Her father retired. Captain Robert Peterson was her only remaining supporter, but his support was a poisoned chalice. He stormed around her apartment, a red-faced bull of a man, railing against the politicians and traitors who were hanging his daughter out to dry. "This is what happens when you let them run the show." He bellowed, his voice thick with the whiskey he'd been drinking since breakfast. "In my day, we'd have handled this." A quiet apology, a transfer for a few months. This Judge Jackson would have understood. "We took care of our own." "They have a video, Dad," Vicky said, her voice hollow. "So what? It's your word against his. You're a cop." "They have Miller's testimony, too," she added quietly. Her father stopped pacing, his face purpling with rage. "That little rat, I knew he was soft. I told Donovan not to partner you with him." The mention of Donovan's name sent another pang of betrayal through Vicky. Captain Donovan, her father's protégé, The man who had called her family was now completely unreachable. He was screening her calls. Her lawyer, Art Friedman, offered no comfort. He was a pragmatist paid by the police union to mitigate damage, not perform miracles. "Let's be brutally honest, Vicky," he said, leaning back in his worn office chair. "The video is a catastrophe. The victim is a judge. Your partner has flipped, and the DA, a woman named Evelyn Reed, who is looking to make a name for herself as a reformer, has taken a personal interest in this case." He slid a document across the desk. "They're offering a plea deal." Vicky stared at it. Pleading guilty to a felony assault charge, resigning from the police force permanently, a recommendation of probation, but with a suspended prison sentence hanging over her head. "No," she spat, pushing it back. "No deal. I'm not a criminal." "Then you're going to trial." Friedman sighed, rubbing his temples. "And Evelyn Reed is going to paint you as the poster child for police brutality. She's going to crucify you." As if on cue, the wolves began to circle closer. A reporter from the city's main newspaper, a tenacious journalist named Ben Carter, started digging into Vicky's past. He began contacting the people who had filed those unfounded complaints against her over the years. This time, people were willing to talk. The first story dropped a week later. The headline, "A Pattern of Abuse. Judge's Assault. Not the first for Officer Peterson." The article detailed the story of a young Hispanic man named Diego Ruiz, who claimed Vicky had illegally searched his car 2 years prior, planting a baggie of marijuana when she found nothing else. The charges were later dropped, but the complaint against Vicky was buried. Now Ruiz was speaking on the record, his voice no longer trembling with fear. Then came another story. A black woman, a single mother named Keisha Williams, recounted how Vicky had harassed her for months, stopping her, constantly accusing her of dealing drugs from her apartment in a low-income housing project. The complaint had gone nowhere. One by one, the ghosts of Vicky's past were rising their stories, weaving a tapestry that corroborated the narrative being built against her. She wasn't a good cop who made one mistake. She was a bully with a badge who had finally bullied the wrong person. The media portrayed her father not as a decorated hero, but as the architect of a corrupt system that enabled his daughter's behavior. The financial toll was also mounting. Suspended without pay, her savings began to dwindle under the weight of mounting legal fees for a top-tier criminal defense attorney she was forced to hire after firing the union-provided Friedman. The plea deal, once an insult, now seemed like a lifeline she had foolishly refused. Her empire had never been the department or the city. Her empire was the fear she inspired, the impunity she enjoyed, the certainty that she was above the consequences that governed everyone else. Now she was utterly alone, a queen with no subjects, no allies, and no kingdom. All she had left was her own stubborn pride, and even that was beginning to feel like a liability. The trial was no longer a fight for her job. It was a fight for her freedom. The courtroom was a pressure cooker. Every seat was filled with journalists, activists, off-duty cops, and curious members of the public. The trial of the state versus Victoria Peterson was the biggest legal drama the city had seen in decades. Vicky sat at the defense table, ramrod straight, in a severe grey suit, trying to project an image of stoic confidence she was far from feeling. The woman she had been just months ago, feared, respected, in control, seemed like a stranger. The prosecutor district attorney, Evelyn Reed, was everything Vicky's lawyer had warned her about. She was sharp, eloquent, and relentless. In her opening statement, she didn't just paint a picture of a single assault. She told a story of a systemic abuse of power with Vicky as the main character. "This case is about more than a slap," Reed declared, her voice resonating through the silent courtroom. "It is about a police officer who believed she was a law unto herself. It is about an officer who saw the color of a man's skin before she saw the man himself. And it is about what happens when that unchecked power collides with a citizen who refuses to be intimidated, a citizen who by chance happened to be a judge." The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They started with Officer Miller. The rookie, looking nervous but resolute, took the stand and walked the jury through the entire incident. He recounted Vicky's derogatory comments in the patrol car, her lie about the turn signal, and her escalating rage. "Why didn't you stop her?" Reed asked, her tone gentle. "I was intimidated," Miller admitted, shamefaced. "She's a senior officer. She has a reputation. I was afraid of what she would do to my career." Next was Mrs. Gable, the dog walker. A grandmotherly woman with a clear, steady voice, she described the scene from an observer's perspective, her testimony aligning perfectly with Miller's. Then Reed played the cell phone video on a large screen for the jury. The grainy footage was still shocking. The collective gasp in the courtroom was audible. But the most dramatic moment came when Evelyn Reed called her final witness. The people called the Honorable Theron Jackson to the stand. A hush fell over the room as the judge walked to the witness box. He moved with the same unhurried dignity he'd shown on the day of the incident. He was not there as a judge, but as a victim, yet he still commanded the room's absolute attention. Reed led him through his testimony. He spoke in calm, measured tones, recounting the events without embellishment or anger. He simply stated the facts. He had been pulled over without cause. He had complied with all instructions. He had been verbally abused. And then he had been assaulted. It was during the cross-examination that Vicky's high-priced defense attorney, a bulldog named Wallace Thorne, made his move. His strategy was clear: to provoke the judge to make him seem angry and unreasonable, to suggest he had used his position to escalate the situation. Judge Jackson Thorne began, his voice oozing insincere respect. "You're a man of great power and influence, are you not?" "I am a public servant, Mr. Thorne," the judge replied calmly. A public servant who, when questioned by a police officer, doing her job, immediately began issuing veiled threats about filing complaints. "Isn't that right?" I informed the officer of my intention to file a complaint after she falsely accused me of a traffic violation and refused to properly identify herself when I questioned her basis for the stop. Judge Jackson corrected him. Thorne paced before the jury. "So you grew angry. You, a powerful judge, were angry that this officer, this woman, dared to question you, Judge." Jackson paused, looking not at Thorne, but directly at the jury. "No, Mr. Thorne. I was not angry. I was disappointed, and I was saddened. Saddened that an officer of the law would conduct herself with such unprofessionalism and hostility. My position is irrelevant. She would not have been entitled to slap me if I were a plumber, a teacher, or an unemployed man. The assault was not on a judge. It was on a citizen." Thorne tried again, attempting to twist the judge's words, but he couldn't land a blow. Judge Jackson remained unflappable, his credibility a shield of solid steel. The final piece of evidence from the prosecution was Vicky's own body cam footage. Her lawyer had fought to have it suppressed, but the judge, a different judge presiding over the trial, had allowed it. The technical team had managed to recover the audio, which had been mysteriously corrupted. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Vicky's own voice filled the room, sharp and laced with contempt. "Judge her nice try, pal. I'm tired of you people lying to me. Get out of the car now." Hearing her own words, stripped of the adrenaline and self-righteousness of the moment, Vicky finally understood. She wasn't just losing the trial. She was being unmasked. The jury wasn't just seeing a cop who made a mistake. They were seeing a bully who had finally been caught. The evidence wasn't just a collection of facts. It was a mirror, and in it she saw the monster she had become. The 2 hours and 17 minutes the jury spent deliberating felt like a year in a vacuum for Vicky Peterson. She sat at the defense table, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were bone white. The severe grey suit she wore felt like a costume, a poor attempt to disguise the terrified woman drowning within it. Her lawyer, Wallace Thorne, tried to project an aura of calm, occasionally leaning over to whisper hollow reassurances. Jury deliberations are unpredictable. A long wait can be a good sign. It means they're debating. But Vicky saw the nervous tick in his jaw, the way his eyes kept darting to the courtroom door. He was preparing for the worst. The courtroom itself was a pressure cooker of simmering tension. Journalists sat poised over their laptops, fingers hovering like runners in the blocks waiting for the starting pistol. In the front row, Vicky's father, Robert Peterson, was a statue of simmering rage, his face a mottled red. He had tried everything. He'd made calls to old contacts who suddenly had poor reception. He'd attempted to glare down witnesses from his seat, only to receive a stern warning from a bailiff. His power, once a tangible force in this city, had evaporated, leaving only the bitter residue of his reputation. Across the aisle sat Keisha Williams and Diego Ruiz, two of Vicky's past victims brought to the trial by the DA's office. They weren't there for revenge. They were there as silent, potent symbols of the history that had finally caught up with Vicky. Then a buzz. A bailiff spoke into his radio, and the tension in the room snapped taut. "They're coming back," Thorne muttered, straightening his tie. The jury filed in their faces, exhausted and grim. Vicky scanned each one, desperately searching for a flicker of sympathy, a hint of doubt, but found nothing. They moved with a heavy, unified purpose, refusing to make eye contact with the defense table. The foreman, a middle-aged woman whose expression had been unreadable throughout the trial, now looked resolute, her eyes filled with a weary certainty. She handed the folded verdict slip to the bailiff. The walk from the jury box to the bench seemed to stretch into an eternity. The rustle of the paper as the judge unfolded it was like a crack of thunder in the tomb-like silence. Vicky's world narrowed to that single sheet of paper. Her hearing faded to a dull roar. In the matter of the state versus Victoria Peterson on the charge of felony assault. The presiding judge, Judge Al-Hassan, began his voice devoid of emotion. He looked to the foreman. "Madam Foreman, has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the woman said, her voice clear and steady. "And on the charge of felony assault, how do you find the defendant?" "Victoria Peterson." The foreman turned her eyes, locking with Vicky's for the first time. In that gaze, Vicky saw no malice, only a profound sense of civic duty. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." The word did not register as a sound, but as a physical impact. It was a punch to the gut that knocked all the air from her body, a blinding white light that obliterated all thought. The courtroom erupted. Her father roared her name, a primal cry of disbelief and fury. The reporters' keyboards exploded into a clattering frenzy. A quiet, cathartic sob broke from Keisha Williams. Through it all, Vicky was frozen, a statue of disbelief. Guilty. She, a Peterson, a cop, a queen, was a convicted felon. The sentencing held a week later was less a legal proceeding and more a final public autopsy of Vicky's career and character. DA Evelyn Reed, sensing a historic victory, delivered a prosecutorial masterclass. For 10 years, Reed began pacing slowly before the bench Victoria Peterson operated, not as an officer of the peace, but as a predator with a badge. This assault was not an aberration. It was an inevitability. It was the culmination of 1,000 smaller acts of cruelty and corruption. She gestured to where Keisha Williams and Diego Ruiz sat. Ask Mr. Ruiz, who was humiliated and falsely accused. Ask Ms. Williams, who was terrorized in her own community. They and many others were the dress rehearsals for the day she finally chose the wrong victim. Reed's voice rose with passion. To give this woman probation would be a betrayal of every citizen who has ever been wronged by a person in power. It would validate the very arrogance that led her here. It would reinforce the cynical belief that there are two systems of justice in this city, one for the connected and one for everyone else. Today, this court has the opportunity to declare in a clear and unequivocal voice that in this city, there is only one, and no one is above it. Wallace Thorne's rebuttal was desperate. He spoke of her father's legacy, her dedication, the pressures of the job. He tried to paint her as a soldier, broken by the war she was fighting. Does one terrible, regrettable mistake warrant the destruction of a life dedicated to public service, he pleaded. But his words sounded hollow, a weak counterpoint to the powerful testimony the court had already heard. Then Judge Al-Hassan spoke, his gaze like iron. He looked down not just at Vicky, but at the entire system she represented. Ms. Peterson, you stand before this court as a symbol. He said, his voice cold and precise. You took an oath to uphold the law. Instead, you treated it as your personal weapon. You wielded your authority not as a shield to protect the innocent, but as a club to intimidate the vulnerable. The damage you have done extends far beyond the physical injury to Judge Jackson. You have eroded the public trust, which is the bedrock of a civil society. You have stained the badge that thousands of honorable officers wear with pride. He paused, his eyes sweeping the room before landing back on Vicky. You and your father before you built an empire. It was an empire of fear, an empire of impunity, an empire built on the cynical belief that the rules did not apply to you, but you built this empire on a foundation of sand. Today, the tide of justice comes in. Vicky felt a cold dread creep up her spine. This was it. The reckoning. It is the sentence of this court. Judge Al-Hassan declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. That you, Victoria Peterson, be sentenced to a term of no less than 2 years and no more than 5 years in the state correctional facility, effective immediately. The sentence was a hammer blow. 2 to 5 years. Prison. The words shattered the last remnants of her denial. Her father screamed a raw, wounded sound, lunging forward before being swarmed by bailiffs. You're destroying her life. She's my daughter. Vicky didn't even hear him. She was in a state of freefall. 2 bailiffs approached her, their movements practiced and impersonal. One of them gently took her hands. Stand up, Ms. Peterson. She rose on unsteady legs. She saw the glint of steel. She felt the cold, mechanical click of the handcuffs as they locked around her wrists, a sound she had initiated 1,000 times, but had never truly heard until now. The shame was a physical fire consuming her from the inside out. As they led her from the courtroom, Her fallen empire lay in smoking ruins. Her career, her name, her freedom all gone. The federal investigation sparked by her case was already gutting the corrupt infrastructure that had protected her. As she was guided through the side door, she risked one last look back. Her eyes met those of Judge Theron Jackson, who had been a silent observer in the back row. He wasn't smiling. He didn't look triumphant. His face was a mask of profound, sorrowful vindication. He wasn't looking at a vanquished foe. He was looking at the painful, necessary, and tragic conclusion of justice being served. The transition from Officer Victoria Peterson to inmate number 734 was a brutal and systematic annihilation of self. The intake process at Riverbend State Correctional Facility was designed to strip away every vestige of a former life. Her severe grey suit was replaced with a coarse, ill-fitting jumpsuit. Her name was replaced with a number. Her identity was reduced to a file containing her crime assault on a public official. A crime that in this inverted world made her a pariah among the lawless and a celebrity among the guards who knew her story. The first few months were a living hell. In the general population, being a former cop was like wearing a target. A group of inmates led by a woman serving time for armed robbery, whom Vicky vaguely remembered arresting years ago, made her life a daily misery. It wasn't just overt violence. It was a campaign of psychological warfare. Her food was spat in her bunk was trashed, and whispers of pig followed her everywhere. The arrogance that had been her shield on the streets was now a liability, marking her as someone who needed to be broken. The breaking point came during a sweltering afternoon in the prison yard. She was cornered near the laundry building by 3 other inmates. There was no grand confrontation, no dramatic fight. There was just a quiet, menacing threat and a demand for her commissary items. The old Vicky would have snarled, would have fought, would have asserted her dominance. But the old Vicky was gone. She looked into their hard eyes and saw not criminals to be subdued, but the absolute rulers of this new kingdom. With trembling hands, she handed over her bag of chips and a book of stamps. It was a total unconditional surrender. In that moment of profound humiliation, she finally understood fear from the other side. She retreated into herself, learning the art of invisibility. She kept her eyes down. She spoke only in monosyllables. She did her prison job scrubbing floors in the infirmary with a silent, meticulous focus. In the crushing silence of her cell at night, the ghosts of her past came to visit. Not just Judge Jackson, but all of them. Diego Ruiz, whom she'd terrified over a bogus traffic stop. Keisha Williams, whom she'd dismissed as just another project dweller. Dozens of faces, all victims of her casual contempt, paraded through her mind. She saw her father's face too, not as the hero she'd idolized, but as the architect of her own arrogance, a man who taught her that power was a birthright, not a responsibility. On the outside, the world she had helped shatter was slowly being rebuilt. The DOJ's consent decree hit the police department like a tidal wave. Captain Miles Donovan was forced into a disgraceful early retirement, his career ending under the shadow of the federal investigation her case had triggered. Officer Miller, once the timid rookie, became a key figure in the reform efforts. He was promoted to training officer, where he used a heavily redacted transcript of his testimony against Vicky as a core part of his curriculum on ethics and the critical duty to intervene when a partner crosses the line. Judge Theron Jackson's work became even more influential. The Jackson Institute for Justice Reform secured major funding and began implementing pilot programs that placed community leaders and law enforcement in the same room to hash out their differences. His goal wasn't just to punish bad cops, but to prevent them from ever being created. He spoke not of vengeance, but of building trust, one painful, honest conversation at a time. 2.5 years after she entered Riverbend, Victoria Peterson walked out of the gates. The world felt impossibly loud and fast. Paroled to a grimy halfway house, her life was now a series of rules. She didn't make curfews, mandatory group meetings, weekly check-ins with a parole officer, who looked at her with undisguised disdain. After a month of searching, she found a job washing dishes and bussing tables at a 24-hour diner working the graveyard shift. The work was grueling and anonymous, her hands perpetually raw from hot water and cleaning chemicals. She, who had once held the power of life and death, now spent her nights clearing away half-eaten plates for tired truckers and night owls. It was the most honest work she had ever done. One rainy Tuesday morning around 4 a.m., the bell over the diner door chimed. An older man in a simple raincoat walked in, shaking the water from his shoulders. He sat down at a booth in her section. When Vicky approached with a coffee pot and a laminated menu, she looked at his face, and her blood ran cold. It was Judge Theron Jackson. Panic seized her. 1,000 frantic thoughts screamed through her mind. He recognized me. He's here to confront me. To get me fired, he'll tell my boss who I am. Her hand trembled, sloshing coffee onto the table. "I'm so sorry, sir," she stammered, fumbling with a rag. The judge looked up and his eyes met hers. There was no anger in them, no pity, only a quiet, weary recognition. He watched her for a long moment, seeing not the snarling officer from the side of the road or the convicted felon from the headlines, but the tired, scared woman in a stained apron standing before him. He offered a small, sad smile. "Hello, Victoria," he said, his voice impossibly gentle. It was the first time he had ever used her first name. "I hope you are well." She could only nod, unable to form words. He didn't say anything else. He ordered a black coffee and a slice of toast. She brought it to him, her movements stiff and robotic. He ate quietly, reading a newspaper. When he was finished, he placed a $10 bill on the table for his $3 check. As he stood up and put on his raincoat, he paused. "Everyone deserves a new foundation, Ms. Peterson," he said softly, and then he was gone. Vicky stood frozen, staring at the $10 bill. It wasn't a tip. It was a message. It wasn't forgiveness, because some things could never be forgiven. It was something more profound. It was a release. It was an acknowledgement that her debt, at least to him, had been paid. The empire of Queen Vicky was not just gone. Its memory had been ground into dust. A sob caught in her throat, hot and sharp. She leaned against the counter, hidden from the few remaining customers, and for the first time since her conviction, she wept. Not for her lost career, or her lost freedom, or her lost name. She wept for the woman she could have been, and for the immense, painful grace of a second chance. On the barren, salted earth of her own ruin, a single tiny, fragile seed had just been planted. It wasn't a kingdom, but for the first time in her life, it felt like hope. That's the story of how a single, arrogant act of violence brought an entire, corrupt empire crashing down. It's a stark reminder that true power isn't found in a badge or a uniform, but in character and integrity. Officer Peterson believed she was above the law, but she learned that the law, like karma, has a long memory and an unforgiving grip. Judge Jackson didn't seek revenge. He sought justice, and in doing so, he sparked a revolution of accountability that reformed an intercity. If this story resonated with you, and if you believe that no one should be above the law, please hit that like button to show your support. Share this video with others who need to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of karma and justice. What did you think of the sentence Vicky received? Let us know in the comments below.